This is a presentation I gave at the Capitalist Realism 10 Years On symposium last February at University of Huddersfield in the UK. In it, I presented the case of current Latin American struggles against neoliberalism, to point at the limitations of the idea of capitalist realism, or the impossibility to imagine alternatives to capitalism as put forward by Mark Fisher in 2010. It is very telling in this regard that Fisher's book of the same title only presents musical examples from the US music industry. Even more so is the fact that Fisher didn't pay the slightest attention to non-capitalist projects like those of Cuba or Venezuela. Finally, I focus on the recent social revolt in Chile, presenting some examples of functions that music has played in the creation of a social subject, a collective force that effectively contests the neoliberalization of life by articulating different emancipatory agendas. I interpret this informed by authors such as Hart Negri and Rancière. Since this was written just before the COVID-19 pandemic was declared, I'll present it here in its original form, without updates, as to the impact that the pandemic and other very recent events have had in the social processes described. If 2016 was a key year for politics in the Anglophone sphere, marked by the election of Trump and Brexit referendum, 2019 was similarly loaded with pivotal political events in Latin America. The year started with the coming to power of Brazil's far-right president Bolsonaro on the 1st of January. Not long after, massive wildfires affected the Amazon, with founded suspicions of them having been intentionally lit to clear land for agriculture. Bolsonaro's government was notorious for its inaction on the matter. Further destruction to cultural heritage and threats to indigenous and social activists have confirmed the fears about his extreme right government. Since the 23rd of January 2019, right-wing forces backed by the US attempted to take power in Venezuela by means of declaring a parallel interim government. The Bolivarian socialist project that Hugo Chavez began in 1999 had suffered countless sabotage attempts from US-backed right-wing forces, including alleged assassination attempts and strangling economic sanctions. However, a mobilization of international forces to the extent observed last year, with the declaration of a parallel government, full international embargo, freezing of offshore capitals and expropriation of state-owned international oil companies, were thus far unseen. What amounts to a classic US orchestrated coup attempt, which has caused enormous harm to the Venezuelan people, can be regarded as unsuccessful. Despite disputes over his legitimacy, power effectively remains so far in the hands of Nicolás Maduro, as re-elected president since the May 2018 presidential elections. Ecuador, in its turn, had its own popular progressive left-wing government with Rafael Correa since 2007. After the coming to power of his successor, Lenin Moreno, in 2017, the latter has shown a clear turn towards neoliberal policies. In the Anglophone world, his most notorious move might have registered as the ceasing to provide Julian Assange political asylum in the London embassy in April last year. For the Ecuadorian people, however, a clear sign of the changing direction of Moreno's government had come 2 months earlier, when the president announced a $10 billion loan from the IMF and the World Bank, while unequivocally taking distance from his predecessor's alliance with Venezuela. By June 2019, the Ecuadorian government's announcement to grant the US Army access to air bases in Galapagos Island sparked a first wave of protests on both environmental and anti-imperialist grounds. By September, the government was protested by pro-choice groups for failing to pass proposed legislation decriminalizing abortion for victims of rape. But the largest wave of social unrest was yet to come. On the 1st of October, Moreno announced a package of austerity measures related to the conditions of the aforementioned IMF credit. 2 days later, mass anti-government protests erupted, which paralyzed the country for the successive 10 days. Masses of people with a distinctive indigenous base mobilized from the provinces into the capital to demonstrate. After being forced to flee Quito and relocate his administration to the city of Guayaquil, Moreno backtracked and left the economic package without effect. In Chile, on 18th of October, an announced rise in the price of public transport in Santiago sparked mass protests, perhaps inspired by the images recently seen from Ecuador. I will refer to this in more detail in the next section, though. In Bolivia, the indigenous-led progressive left-wing government of Evo Morales, which had been re-elected in the 20th of October elections, suffered a sabotage similar to that seen in Venezuela 10 months earlier. Following escalating violence and threats from sectors of the military and police aligned with the right wing, President Evo Morales was forced to resign on 10th of November and flee the country in what amounts to a coup d'etat. Violent attacks by police and right-wing paramilitaries have been documented against the largely indigenous population that constituted Morales' political base. Since last 21st of November, protests also erupted in Colombia in response to Iván Duque's government economic, social and environmental policies. On top of the way they have managed the peace process with the FARC guerrillas, and increasing cases of selective assassination of social leaders. Other such cases can be observed in other countries of the region too, but a case-by-case examination would exceed the purpose of this overview. What the process here outlined have shown in common is violent repression of socially progressive forces inflicted by reactionary right-wing factions, often with the support of the US. Now, returning to the case of Chile, to observe it in more depth, the Chilean people have known of neoliberal economy since its very inception. Even before the term was used to designate this particular flavor of capitalism that promotes market deregulation, privatization of public assets, and cuts to government spending. In the 1970s, under Pinochet's dictatorship, a group of young Chilean economists who had studied in the US under Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek found the ideal conditions to experiment with this capitalist approach, i.e. no effective political opposition imposed by the force of violent dissident suppression. Friedman and Hayek themselves visited Chile in the late 70s to observe this experiment and praised their pupils' efforts, eventually labeling this the miracle of Chile. The dictatorship officially gave place to a transition to democracy from 1990. The end point of this transition period remains unclear, if consummated. Pinochet's constitution remains the base of Chilean law to this day, and the hard neoliberal direction of the economy that he left in place has anything but eased. 30 years after the end of the regime, Chile suffers from massive social inequality and a profitable private system of miserable pensions, repression of the Mapuche indigenous people in their quest to recover the land, and lack of justice to the victims of state violence and their families. Resistance to this model indeed existed during and after the dictatorship, yet remained relegated to marginal scenarios. Mainstream politics contented itself with the promises of macroeconomic numbers and justice as far as possible, infamously promoted by subsequent governments. It is in this context that last October, opposition from secondary students to a public transport fare rise sparked an unexpected revolt against decades of neoliberal oppression in the wider society. Protests in Chile are not a new thing, but the magnitude and ongoing duration of the current social unrest were unseen in post-dictatorial times. Although it began from secondary students, currently the revolt involves social demands from a number of fronts, including working class, feminist, and indigenous. The anti-dictatorship protests that led to the democratic deposing of Pinochet in the 80s was a unitary front of action in which the people protested the tyrant. Today, the revolt is heterogeneous, and so are the demands that drive it. Against patriarchy, against lack of social security, against miserable pensions, against the oppression of indigenous communities, against the social segregation in education, against the political corruption that enables massive inequity, etc. All of these problems are perceived to derive to a great extent from the neoliberal economic model left by Pinochet and facilitated by the constitution written during his regime. The way in which the different social actors have articulated their demands in this massive revolt matches remarkably Hart and Negri's concept of the multitude. In their book of the same title, they define a multitude as an internally different, multiple social subject whose constitution and action is based not on identity or unity, or much less indifference, but on what it has in common. The multitude is thus a new collective subject of emancipation that reflects a multiplicity of struggles. These are articulated by what they have in common, yet not reduced to a common denominator. The multitude could be said to supersede the working class as the traditional unidimensional subject of emancipation. So working class, feminist, migrant, racial, LGBTQ and other fronts co-struggle in their unresolved multiplicity against the common colonial patriarchal capitalist system that oppresses them. What these struggles have in common is the denial of dignity in the way the different fronts are oppressed under the current neoliberal regime. A key in the definition of Hart and Negri's concept of multitude is its difference from the traditional concept of the people. According to Kirchayan, in his book The Left Hemisphere, the principle of unity that defines the people is given by the social contract made between state and citizens. In his Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher describes the current capitalist regime's interpolating of people as consumers, despite them still thinking of themselves as if they were citizens. This might be the case to some degree, although in a much more complex way than how Fisher presents it. Neoliberal flavored capitalism does indeed strive to strip individuals of their condition of political subjects, identifying them instead as mere consumers. It therefore limits the agency of individuals to a matter of purchasing choice. Unlike Fisher, who relies on Zizek and Jameson as main reference to conceptualize his idea of capitalist realism, I find Ranciere's conceptual apparatus particularly apt to interpret the conflict of the citizens as political subject in today's capitalism. To put it in Rancierian terms, the Chilean revolt has clearly shown a process of disidentification from the consumer identity given by the neoliberal police order. Thus, individuals undergo a process of subjectivization or becoming political subjects to collectively constitute the multitude. Key in this process is the function that music has had in particular as means of interpellation towards such subjectivization. Reappropriation of public space has been key in the constitution of the multitude as an active subject, as Hud and Negri had anticipated. Such spaces had long been appropriated by the colonial dictatorial patriarchal system. The occupation of public space has been carried out under a distinctive cultural perspective encompassing renaming of key places in a more meaningful way. Noteworthy is the epicenter of weekly protests in Santiago, which had the official name of Plaza Italia and has been popularly renamed Plaza de la Dignidad. Secondly, defacing of public monuments with a colonial patriarchal connotation, most notably those that commemorated Spanish colonizers and military figures. And third, defiance of civil norms of use of public space by using the streets to perform dance and music, making manifest the peaceful intention of demonstrators. All of this can be appropriately framed within the Rancierian idea of a redistribution of the sensible. In his 2011 book titled Music and the Elusive Revolution, Eric Drodt pointed out three functions that the singing of the Internationale served during the French May 1968 revolts. Signaling a generalized sense of oppositionality, interpellating the working class as a political actor, and traversing the various barriers that separated different social groups from one another. So we have, in summary, confrontational, interpellating, and unifying functions. According to Hud and Negri, the relation between empire and multitude responds to what is often called a voluntarist perspective. The crisis of capitalism does not so much derive from the objective conditions of this system, but from the degree of combativeness of those contesting it, as Kirchhoff points. Thus, the interpellating function that music has played in the Chilean 2019 revolts has to do with its potential to incite a combative attitude. In other words, with their confrontational function, as in Drodt's analysis. One of the first songs to be heralded by the Chilean revolt is Víctor Jara's El Derecho de Vivir en Paz. The song was originally written in 1971 and dedicated to Ho Chi Minh in the context of the Vietnam liberation. 2 years later, it was the Chilean people's turn to struggle for the right to live in peace, when the CIA-backed coup led by Pinochet took the country and held power officially for 17 years. Jara himself, amongst masses of militants and left-wing sympathizers, were apprehended and taken to improvised detention centers. The singer was tortured and murdered, as has been widely documented. A combination of lyrics content, affective resonances, and historical connotations thus enabled the interpellative potential of this song in 2019. This song has not only been sung by the multitude in the protests, but also played loudly from popular barrios to the very city center during the enforced curfews that President Piñera decreed as part of the state of exemption during the first weeks of the revolt. This points to the confrontational aspect described by Drott. Thus, the peace that this song calls for is the antithesis not of war, but of ongoing state violence. Peace as the alternative to the violence with which neoliberalism oppresses everyone but the few who profit from it. In the words of Harta Negri, when war has become a foundational element of politics, and when the state of exemption has become permanent, then peace is elevated for the multitude to the highest value, the necessary condition for any liberation. Together with the Internationale, one of the most famous protest songs worldwide is The People United Will Never Be Defeated. It was written mere months before the 1973 coup by Chilean composer Sergio Ortega, and originally performed by Andean folk ensemble Quilapayún. The song traversed borders and has been widely reinterpreted in numerous fashions and languages. Besides its face value call for unity of the people in struggle, it is its historical origin in the immediately pre-dictatorship socialist government of Allende that currently expresses society's rejection of Pinochet's legacy. Emblematic song adopted by demonstrators in Chile is El Baile de los que Sobran, from 1986 by Chilean rock band Los Prisioneros. The lyrics talk about the lack of prospects for working-class secondary students. In the late years of Pinochet's dictatorship, instead of singing about freedom, justice or democracy, which were the main fronts of political struggle back then, this young band targeted the false promises and precarious conditions already felt by the youth under early neoliberalism. The refrain makes a direct call to join the dance of those left behind. Hence the highly interpellating power that it still has 30 years later for those subsumed in neoliberal precarity.
A otros que enseñaron secretos que admiró, a otros dieron libertad, estos a llamada educación. Ellos tenían esfuerzo, ellos tenían dedicación. ¿Y para qué? Para terminar bailando y pateando piedras. De los que sobran, nadie nos marcha jamás, nadie nos ayudar de verdad. La 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 la. La 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 la.
It is meaningful that most of the songs that serve an interpolating function come from bygone times, The examples seen so far from 1971, 73 and 86. When many of the current protesters were either not yet born or not old enough to have experienced their full meaning in the original historical context. This speaks of a transmission of cultural signification, which makes these songs propitious to play an intergenerational unifying function too. Other newer songs and protest chants have indeed emerged in and from this social process. Most notably, we should pay attention to the chant El violador eres tú, the rapist is you, by Chilean feminist collective Las Tesis. Although it addresses a specific struggle, it found a place to manifest and spread within the general social movement. Now, given the wide relevance of the anti-patriarchal struggle, it quickly spread around the world, with street performances in a number of countries that would merit a study of its own.
Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. Y la culpa no era mía, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. El violador eras tú. El violador eres tú. Son los pacos. Los jueces. El Estado. El presidente. ¡Asesino! El Estado opresor es un macho violador. El Estado opresor es un macho violador.
As a way to conclude, I would like to point how Fisher proclaimed the inability to imagine an alternative to capitalism, in what I would describe as a myopic Anglocentrism. Such alternatives were and are not only possible to imagine, but actually being fought for around the world. The repeated attempts by the US to crush these projects on the margins of world capitalism for the past 60 years show how the problem is not an ethereal impossibility to imagine alternatives, but the fact that wherever real alternatives emerge, these are violently sabotaged by the empire. Examples of these are the recent imperialist maneuvers that, with varying results, have attempted to crush socialist projects in Latin America. By contrast, in the case of neoliberal economies, the Chilean revolt of 2019 is living proof that people are indeed able to think, imagine and dream beyond the imposed realm of neoliberal capitalism. Furthermore, they are taking action, fighting every day for a better future.